Two cave disasters, both horrifying. But the first story we're about to explore is in a league of its own, not because of the cave, but because of the man trapped inside. A man whose anger became his worst enemy. A man who fought his rescuers until his body gave out. Viewer discretion is advised. It was late Saturday evening, the 1st of October, 1983, when 6 experienced cave explorers began their descent into the depths of Drybulbis Cave, a dark and winding system hidden near the quiet town of Kutztown in Berks County, Pennsylvania. These weren't thrill-seeking amateurs. These were seasoned spelunkers who had spent countless hours navigating tight, twisting passages beneath the earth. They knew caves, they respected the dangers, and they trusted each other with their lives. The cave they entered that evening was familiar ground, a place they had likely explored before without incident. For hours, the group crawled, climbed, and squeezed through the underground network, moving deeper into the earth where daylight is a forgotten memory. Everything went smoothly. There was laughter, careful conversation, and the steady rhythm of exploration. But as the early morning hours approached, fatigue began to set in, and they decided it was time to head back to the surface. At around 2 a.m., the group began their return journey. The man at the rear was 36-year-old Robert E. Scott, a strong, capable outdoorsman, bringing up the last position to ensure everyone else got out safely. Ahead of him, 2 cavers had already made their way through a vertical crevice about 75 feet from the cave's entrance. It was a tight but passable section, a narrow slot stretching 80 feet high, generally about 12 inches wide. For anyone accustomed to caves, this wasn't unusual. Tight passages are part of the game. But nature had played a cruel trick with this particular passage. About midway through, the walls pinched inward, squeezing down to just 7 or 8 inches before widening out again below. It was a geological choke point easy to slip past if everything went right, but completely unforgiving if it didn't. As Scott worked his way into the crevice, disaster struck. His hand slipped on the wet, mud-coated rock. In an instant, gravity took over, and Scott dropped down into the narrowest part of the passage. His body twisted sideways, and suddenly he was wedged trapped on his left side, the cold rock pressing into his ribs and hips like an unyielding vice. He tried to move, he tried to back out, but every surface around him was slick, polished smooth by thousands of years of underground water. There was nothing to push against, nothing to grab. The walls hugged him so tightly that even breathing became a conscious effort. His teammates realized something was wrong when his voice stopped echoing forward. They scrambled back and found him stuck fast in the narrow slot. At first, there was confidence they had all been in tough squeezes before. They tried everything they knew, pulling on his arms, shifting his hips, even attempting to grease the rock with mud. But Scott wasn't budging. With every effort, the realization grew heavier. This was no ordinary jam. Hours dragged by in the suffocating darkness. The sound of water dripping from the cave ceiling was broken only by the grunts of effort and Scott's labored breathing. By sunrise, it became clear they were in over their heads. After 8 hours of trying, Scott's friends made a painful decision. They would have to leave him behind and bring back help. Imagine that moment, the cold, gnawing fear of walking away from a friend who is buried alive, knowing that every minute could be his last. By 9:30 a.m. on Sunday, local rescue teams had mobilized. Firefighters from 4 different departments rushed to the scene, hauling ropes, pulleys, and every tool they could think of. These were men and women accustomed to danger, but cave rescue is a different beast entirely. This wasn't a car accident on a road. This was a fight in a black, winding labyrinth, where even reaching the victim required crawling through rock that could crush the unprepared. Realizing the scope of the challenge, authorities called in the National Cave Rescue Commission. By late afternoon, 14 of the best-trained cave rescuers in the country had flown in from Pittsburgh. These weren't ordinary first responders, they were specialists who had spent years mastering the art of underground rescue. They arrived with cutting-edge gear, technical knowledge, and a single mission: get Robert Scott out alive. When they first made contact with him, hope surged. After more than 12 hours trapped, Scott was still alert, still talking. He even managed a bit of gallows humor. But time inside a cave doesn't just grind down the body, it shreds the mind. As the long hours turned into night, something inside Scott began to fracture. At first, it was frustration snapping at rescuers, questioning their methods. But then the anger exploded into pure, venomous rage. He started screaming obscenities, lashing out at the very people who had come to save him. His voice echoed through the rock like an animal's cry, raw and unrelenting. He cursed the rescuers, called them idiots, and accused them of making things worse. He twisted violently, thrashing against the walls, destroying hours of delicate progress in seconds. This wasn't just fear, it was something deeper. Doctors on the surface knew Scott was epileptic, and he'd been medicated to prevent seizures. But the drugs did nothing to tame his fury. His mind was unraveling under the combined weight of terror, exhaustion, and physical pain. The rescuers faced an impossible dilemma. They couldn't fight him, he was jammed in a space barely wide enough for his chest. If they pulled too hard, they could crush his ribs or snap his spine. Sedation seemed like the only answer. If they could just calm him, maybe they could pull him free. But the doctors in charge refused to authorize it. In their eyes, sedating someone that deep underground, without hospital resources, was too risky. The rescuers even tried to patch through a long-distance call to California, hoping to reach a doctor who understood caving emergencies, but time was slipping away. Meanwhile, the cave continued its silent assault. The temperature hovered in the low 50s Fahrenheit. Hypothermia was a relentless enemy. Rescuers improvised like madmen, stuffing heat packs around his body, blasting high-intensity lights for warmth, even running electrical cords into the earth to blow warm air through hairdryers up his pant legs. They fed him coffee, broth, even donuts, anything to keep his strength up. But all the warmth and calories in the world couldn't undo the damage of crushing confinement. Technically, the team tried everything. They rigged a high line above him, looped slings around his chest and legs, and tried to haul him upward. They coated him in grease to reduce friction. They inflated air bladders under his body, hoping to lift him free. They even lined the cave walls with slick plastic sheets. Nothing worked. The rock was merciless. By Monday morning, Scott had been trapped for more than 24 hours. His rants had become more unhinged, his breathing more ragged. Around 7 a.m., as he launched into another tirade, his vitals suddenly crashed. The monitors flatlined. His body went limp. Rescuers swarmed him, pumping oxygen into his lungs, flooding his veins with heated fluids. But deep inside that tomb of stone, nothing worked. Scott's body had finally surrendered after nearly 30 hours of hell. On the 27th of December, 2003, 8 boys from the San Antonio Boys Village set out on what was supposed to be an adventure. Accompanied by 2 counselors, their destination was Boy Scout Cave in Florida, a well-known local spot, famous for its twisting passages and bone-dry chambers. Among the group were 2 teenagers, 15-year-old Michael Shiro and 16-year-old Harvick Henderson, both eager for the thrill of exploration. The counselors, believing the cave to be safe and citing their larger size, decided to remain outside. They had no idea that choice would nearly cost 2 boys their lives. Boy Scout Cave had a reputation. Its narrow, angular passages could challenge even experienced spelunkers, but it was considered stable, safe enough for an afternoon crawl. The boys entered shortly after noon, armed with just 9 flashlights between them. As the group descended, the temperature dropped to a cool 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The deeper they went, the quieter it became until the cave swallowed every sound except their own footsteps and breathing. Outside, one counselor lit a small fire near the entrance to keep warm, never realizing that such a simple act could complicate the rescue later on. Inside, Michael and Henderson led the charge, confidently weaving through the twisting network of stone. But as they crawled deeper, the cave seemed to close in on them. The passages became tighter, the darkness heavier. Claustrophobia began whispering in the back of their minds. Still, they pressed on, determined to conquer the challenge. An hour in, they reached a notorious section of the cave, a sharp, unforgiving turn called the hairpin curve. It was a brutal squeeze, barely wide enough for a single body to contort through. Without adult supervision, the boys hesitated, but not for long. Michael, bold and restless, pushed ahead. The limestone walls scraped his arms and sides as he wriggled forward, twisting his body to match the jagged angles of the passage. Henderson followed close behind. Then, disaster struck. Halfway through the curve, Henderson's body jammed. He couldn't move forward, couldn't go back. The rock walls dug into his ribs like a vice. He tried shifting, twisting, kicking, nothing worked. Panic surged as his breathing quickened, echoing against the cold stone. Michael realized his friend was trapped and crawled back into the slit, contorting his body in the same tight confines. The scene became frantic. The walls clawed at their skin, their elbows and knees grinding against unyielding rock. Henderson cried out in pain as Michael strained to free him, pulling, shoving, doing anything he could. Minutes dragged into an eternity. The boys' energy bled away in the dark, the jagged stone slicing and bruising their bodies. Michael's muscles quivered, vision blurring with exhaustion. Then, in the cold choke of the passage, he collapsed. Now Henderson was trapped and alone. His desperate screams ricocheted through the cave, bouncing off walls like haunting echoes. Back in the wider tunnel, the remaining boys froze as their flashlights began to dim. Panic swept through the group like wildfire. Someone whispered that the counselor's fire might be burning up all the oxygen inside, feeding hysteria. Realizing they couldn't save their friends, the boys made the gut-wrenching decision to leave. They crawled back toward the surface, hearts pounding with guilt and terror. Above ground, the counselors were stunned by the sight of tear-streaked faces emerging from the cave's mouth. One of them stomped out the fire in horror, while the other fumbled for a phone and called 911. Within an hour, specialized cave rescue teams arrived. They knew what lay ahead. Boy Scout Cave was a nightmare for rescuers, with its narrow, twisting bottlenecks that left no room for error. Inside, they found the remaining boys huddled in fear, convinced they had nearly suffocated. Air tests revealed the truth: the oxygen was fine. The suffocation had been psychological, pure panic. But Henderson and Michael were still deep inside, fading fast. Armed with chisels, harnesses, and unyielding resolve, rescuers inched their way toward the hairpin curve. When they finally reached it, they found Henderson alive, but barely. His body shook violently, his voice a frail whisper. Michael was worse. He lay slumped ahead, his skin cold and grey, breaths shallow and ragged. Rescuers worked frantically, chiseling the rock to widen the slit trapping Henderson. Each hammer strike echoed like a clock ticking down. After an agonizing hour, Henderson was freed, crying, frozen, but alive. They wrapped him in a thermal blanket and began the painstaking crawl out of the cave. Michael's rescue was even more desperate. Every passing minute cut deeper into his chances of survival. 2 hours later, after relentless carving and maneuvering, they pulled his limp body free. His pulse was faint, his skin ice cold. On the surface, medics swarmed him, fighting to bring him back. Both boys were rushed to the hospital, suffering from severe hypothermia and exhaustion. Michael remained unconscious for nearly 24 hours, his life hanging by a thread. In the aftermath, the truth was stark. A lack of preparation, poor equipment, and the absence of adult supervision had almost turned a simple adventure into a double tragedy. Today, Boy Scout Cave sits in silence. But for those who know its story, that silence carries the weight of screams that once echoed through its unforgiving walls.